Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Advent Member Talks, our weekly event that features a different member on the topic of their choosing. My name is Sam. My pronouns are they, them. I'm the Director of Member Experience here at Advent Co-working. We are a creative co-working community, event-based podcast studio, yoga studio, art gallery, most importantly, though a community, and I'm really excited that we have Douglas joining us today. If you've been tuning in regularly for our talks, you'll know that Douglas joined us a few months ago to talk about the upcoming elections, which have now passed, thankfully. And so really excited to have Douglas back with us today. He's going to be discussing the history of Black History Month and its ties to Black-owned businesses. So if you have any questions for Douglas, please go ahead, type those in the comments, and we'll have a Q&A at the end. So Douglas, I will hand it over to you.
Okay. All right. Thanks a lot, Sam. And thank you for having me back again. Hello, everybody. Hope you're having a pretty good week so far. I know that we have some, for those of you who are in Charlotte, if I'm assuming all of you are, having some pretty decent weather today. So I hope you had a chance to enjoy it. But just want to talk to you briefly about the history of Black History Month and its ties to Black-owned businesses. You know, every time I have a discussion about Black History Month or just Black history in general, it always reminds me of how far we are not removed from just, slavery, Jim Crow. And it really, amazes me that if many leaders like Dr. King and other civil rights heroes going back over the years, if they haven't fought for the rights of folks that look like me, we would probably be in a different country today. So let's go back in time a little bit. So back in the early 20th century, there was a lot of change happening in America. Prior to that, in 1896, you had the Atlanta Compromise, where Booker T. Washington said that, African Americans shouldn't focus so much on segregating society, that they should focus on building businesses of their own and working with their hands and building institutions. Where W.E.B. Du Bois, who was one of the founders of the NAACP, pushed back on that and said, no, African Americans need to integrate into society. So going into the early 20th century, you had the formation of many organizations because, remind you now, after the Civil War, you had President Andrew Johnson, who I believe was impeached, and then you had Ulysses S. Grant. He was removed from office, but then you had Ulysses S. Grant, who started to push Reconstruction that was, or that began with President Lincoln. As you know, President Lincoln was assassinated. So Ulysses S. Grant comes in, he serves 2 terms, but after his second term ended, Rutherford B. Hayes was elected and made a compromise, which many of you know is called the Compromise of 1877, 1876, where he made a deal with some southern states. I believe it was South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana. I may be wrong about that, where he said, if you allow your electors to come and vote for me, then I will essentially remove Union troops out South. The deal was made. When that happened, Union troops were moved out of the South, and Jim Crow set in, and then you had a apartheid-like state for the next 100 years. So fast forward, it's now the 1900s. African Americans have been discriminated against in large numbers, to the fact that they have to then form organizations, form essentially their own communities to help support them. So you have the formation of predominantly Black fraternities and sororities like mine, Alpha Phi Alpha, was founded in 1906. Then you had the Vice President sorority, Alpha Kappa Alpha, was formed in 1908. Then you had Delta Sigma Theta, 1913, and it goes on. and on. And then 1909, the NAACP was formed. Then comes 1915. So this was about 50 years after the 13th Amendment was ratified. Two individuals by the name of Carter Woodson, who was a Harvard scholar, and Jesse Moreland, who was a prominent pastor at the time, formed an organization called the Association for the Study of Negro Life in September of 1915. And what this organization did was decided that, we're going to highlight the life of prominent African Americans to let our community know that we have leaders amongst our midst to tell their story. And so they decided to do this and started doing it. But then about 11 years later, in 1926, the organization changed its name to the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. And so what that organization decided to do was to pick the second week in February, ironically, where we are right now, to highlight African Americans and their achievements. And they called it National Negro Week. And they picked the second week in February because they wanted it to coincide with Abraham Lincoln's birthday and Frederick Douglass's birthday. So Abraham Lincoln's birthday is, I believe, the 12th. Frederick Douglass' birthday, I can't recall right off the top of my head when that is. I know it's within this week. And as many of you know, Frederick Douglass was a famous free slave, one of our greatest speakers of the 19th century, and was also a big he was a big abolitionist, and President Lincoln really respected him. And so that's why they wanted to pick the second week in February. And so the decades followed, and this always took place around the second week of February. Then you get to about the 1960s. Then you see that college campuses started saying, "Hey, let's do this on college campuses." The civil rights movement is happening. You have Black awareness taking place. So Black History, Negro Week then turned to Black History Month, but it was mostly on college campuses. So this gained a lot of traction over the 1960s and the 1970s, to the point in 1976, President Gerald Ford proclaimed February as Black History Month. And he said, and I quote, that he's calling upon the public to seize the opportunity to honor the too often neglected accomplishments of Black Americans in every area of endeavor throughout history. And so since 1976, every American president has designated February as Black History Month, and there's always a theme. So for this month's theme, the theme is the Black family, representation, identity, and diversity. So the reason why I said in the beginning how this amazes me so much that Black History Month has only been around for like 45 years, like officially. It's been around longer than that, but like a proclamation for it hasn't been that long. And it just shows you that, that we're not that far removed. I look at like most African Americans that you meet that are probably in my age group. I'm 42, so my parents were born in basically the 30s and the 40s. So you have to realize that they were born like 70 years after the Civil War or something like that. That is insane to think about. So the things that African Americans have been dealing with, and has been going on for 400 years, but just looking at how the Civil War is not that far removed is also very fascinating as well. And so how does this tie to Black businesses? Well, going back to what I was saying earlier, in the years after Reconstruction, and even during the Civil War, African Americans really had to depend on each other. They really did. And so after Reconstruction, African Americans back then, they just couldn't walk into any place of business. They were pushed out. So Black businesses started to pop up really a lot around the 1890s. You had about a couple of thousands that were around Most of them were small. You had your barbershops, your beauty salons, your funeral parlors. Those were popping up a lot, especially in urban areas, because remember, um, Jim Crow laws were pushing African Americans in a segregated society. And so we had to rely on these businesses to help us flourish. Um, back around, I think maybe like um, the early 1900s, the National Negro Business League was established, and there was about 600 chapters across the country, and that was to help promote Black-owned businesses. Booker T. Washington was also a member and founder of that organization. So you're looking around the 1920s, Black businesses are starting to thrive, but then of course the Great Depression really hurt Black businesses even more so than it did white-owned businesses. Again, this is the time of Jim Crow. The civil rights movement would not take place for another 30 years. And it was a very hard time for Black-owned businesses. After the war, they started to um, come back. In fact, Atlanta and Durham were considered Black business meccas in the South. Memphis was also one. Here in North Carolina, for those of you who are familiar with Durham, you probably heard of the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company. If you travel to Raleigh on the Durham Freeway, it's a large building right there. That was started by Mr. C.C. Spalding, who passed away in 1952, actually on his birthday, 78th birthday. When that business was built, by the time of his death, even before that, it was the largest African American business in the country. And basically, what it did was supply burial insurance for African Americans. Again, folks in my community, we couldn't even be buried in the same cemetery as whites, so we had to rely on businesses like the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company. Um, and then you fast forward, businesses started to grow into more the entertainment industry, and the government started a little bit to provide funding and ways of getting access to capital for African American owned businesses, but it just wasn't a lot. And although the African Americans today make up a large portion of, or a significant portion of the consumer index for businesses, um, Black-owned businesses still trail behind when it comes to reaching um, access to capital to be able to form businesses. And again, a lot of that has to do with racism. Um, as you all know, last year we had a racial awakening in this country, followed by the George Floyd murder. And as a result, a lot of companies started to promote Black Lives Matter, even going a step further. A lot of them started looking at their management structure and started to promote more African Americans and people of color to higher management positions. Because I know people don't realize this, but a lot of these large companies, there are not a whole lot of African Americans at the management level. Um, you know, there there aren't a lot of African Americans that have access to the resources needed to start their own business. And so that's what last year did, was to start to look at how deep systemic racism is. And it goes very deep in our society. Even from healthcare, the way that African Americans are cared for as opposed to whites. Even when it comes to just capitalism as a whole, there is a difference there. So yeah, I mean, it's very amazing when you think about this and reflect on this Black History Month, and the fact that the theme is about the Black family, representation, identity, and diversity. It really hones in on what we're talking about today. How we need more representation, more inclusive representation in our workforce. How we need to understand what the Black identity is, and to hone in on that. So again, I look at this month as, a very important month. And I was telling my wife the other just today, growing up in the '80s in New York, I remember Black History Month being almost a celebration. And now I realize why, because back in '85, '86, '87, it was only around at that time about 5 or 6 or 7 years. And so it just lets you realize that this is a month that we all have to cherish, that we all have to celebrate. I always say Black history is American history. African Americans have contributed a lot to this country. In fact, helped build this country, helped build the industries that a lot of them that we see today. And so, for those of you who are business owners like myself on the line today, I ask that just take some time to read up on the history of African Americans, particularly in business. Like I said, we have a couple of great ones here in North Carolina. I mentioned just one that presided in Durham, and to look at the accomplishments that African Americans have made throughout the years. So I guess with that, Sam, I know I'm stopping a little bit early, but I just wanted to take some time for discussion and to ask any questions that folks may have.
Yeah, thank you so much, Douglas. Yeah, so folks watching, if you have any questions, please go ahead and comment those. I got so much history to cover, and yet it was not that long ago.
Yeah.
And so I appreciate you coming on and, giving at least some background information for folks who maybe need to learn more still.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm seeing some typing bubbles here. But yeah, so I guess while we wait for that,
Yeah.
you mentioned the theme that the new administration has. And I'll kind of call back to, we discussed previously potential effects that new policies would have. While we wait for some questions in regards to Black History Month, do you have any updates about?
Not so much on the policies that the Biden administration will be rolling out, but I know, or should I say, I've read that with the COVID-19 relief bill that the administration will be pushing through Congress pretty soon, the president is very focused on making sure that the part of the rescue package that focuses on businesses is definitely streamlined and focused on business of color, particularly African American owned businesses as well. So I think that the administration over time, over the next couple of months, will be, looking at ways to push back on systemic racism as it pertains to economics, healthcare, education. Just the makeup of the cabinet right now, and different agency heads. You can see that the president is working hard to diversify the cabinet and to bring those ideas and that life knowledge that many of these folks have, which can then be turned into policy.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking about the cabinet, and I think something you mentioned too about the importance of diversity, and yet as we have diversity, it's not enough. We also have to work to break down systemic racism. We have to work to break down all of these things and create new programs. But I think there are folks who see this diversity and think, we're over it. We did it. We did the thing. Have you experienced, so we had a question come in. So have you experienced folks saying we no longer need Black History Month? And how do you respond to folks who think that we've made it through, we're better country now?
Well, I haven't heard, and thankfully haven't heard anybody say we don't need Black History Month.
Yeah.
But I have heard the fact that we have arrived and let's move on. We have made a lot of progress over the years. Let's not kid ourselves. We have. But the way I look at it as we've kind of helped improve um, the overall house. You know, we put up new walls, new doors, put up new windows, things that's great. The foundation we still have to work on, because the foundation is where the systemic racism lies. There's a book I'm reading that's called Stamped from the Beginning that really talks about how the visual that many in white America have of African Americans goes back to the very beginning of when the first African was brought to the shores of America. In fact, in that book, in the introduction, it talks about a speech that then Senator Jefferson Davis gave, and Jefferson Davis later on became the president of the Confederate States. There was a discussion on the floor of the US Senate about funding for African Americans, funding for education for African Americans in DC. And I'm just paraphrasing what Senator Davis at the time, who of course argued against it, and said that 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 education should not be equal to education of African Americans. I'm not going to say the word he used, but education of African Americans should not be equal to the education of white Americans, and that there will never be any equality in that between the white man and the black man, because it's been stamped from the beginning, meaning that it was stamped from the time that the first African was brought from Africa to the shores here. So we have a lot more to do. And in the midst of our in the midst of our improved society, you still see remnants of that systemic racism that's there. Where, I mean, I've gone for jobs and I have 3 degrees where I wasn't hired or I wasn't promoted, because, and I know I had a lot to do because I was Black. When it comes to getting a house, sometimes lenders won't lend to you in the same way that they would lend to a white family. Those are things that may not seem like, you know, as visual as we see in the 1960s when people were, you know, getting hosed and being bitten by dogs. But we still have a long way to go. I think the January 6th riots shows that. I think the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery showed that. You know, as African American man, I have to also, you know, sometimes even watch when I go out, watch what I wear, how I act, you know, how I talk, because folks perceive us as being different. And sometimes folks even realize it because it's so ingrained in our society. So yes, we've improved the visual of the house. We've improved the inside of the house. The foundation is what needs to be addressed now.
Absolutely. Yeah, we have to address that foundation.
Yeah.
We had another question come in actually about schools and education. So you mentioned education, and education, well, the lack of it has been used historically for a long time as a tool to keep people oppressed, and to not have the knowledge. And I think also not giving people the knowledge that they need about our true history to help and work to actually break down these systems that have in place of oppressing Black people and oppressing other people of color. So the question here, it's how should schools approach Black History Month and integrating Black history into year-long curriculum?
Yes, I think it should have been a year-long curriculum because, you know, when I was in school, which was again, you know, as far as elementary was in the 80s, and I went to high school in the 90s, we only spoke about Black History Month during Black History. But as I said earlier, Black History Month is American History Month, and it should be in a curriculum because I think that if we begin to teach our children about Black history, about the sins of slavery, and not just slavery, but about the achievements of African Americans, it would change the perception that the upcoming generation will have of not only themselves as African Americans, but that white Americans will have of themselves, of white Americans that will have towards African Americans. I believe that, you know, the millennial generation and Gen Z are going to be the ones to help change the trajectory on that. I am a late Gen Xer. We have made our attempts and still will to this day to help change it. But I think that the more that people see African Americans getting elected to the highest office in the land, like President Obama and now Vice President Kamala Harris, seeing more of that, seeing that, that it's not out of the ordinary to see a person of color as the Bachelor or something like that, or seeing a person of color be in a prominent position in sports or in politics. I think the more that folks see of that, I think the better that we will become as a nation. But going back to education, I really believe that African American history should be included in the curriculums, and it shouldn't just be about slavery. Slavery is a part of it. It's a large part of it. But like I just said here, Black African Americans have been the backbone of this country from the beginning.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, this country was created on stolen land
Mm-hmm.
and built by people who were stolen from their homes. That's the history of our country, and that should be taught all year long. But I think, like you said, also, Black folks in the US and all across the world have given so much to history. Like, why aren't we celebrating more? Why aren't there, more things?
We should. And if you notice, we are now having the first of everything now. The first Black president, first African American vice president, the first Latino this, the first Asian American. So that just shows you, going back to the earlier question, we've come a long way, but the democracy that we live in has been around for 240 years. And we're just getting the first Black president 11 years ago, the first African-American female, the first African-American woman president just last month. And she's also Asian American at the same time. So there's a lot of first that's happening. It's just happening now in this 2021.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you mentioned earlier too that, since the protest, after the murder of George Floyd happened, we've seen a lot of businesses coming out with statements and, changing their policies, changing their hiring practices, their management structures. So a good question just came in about, how can companies and organizations avoid engaging in tokenism and ensure that actual inclusion is happening, such as, in that upper management?
I say that they have to start looking at their employees now, looking at the time they've put in particular African American employees, and start promoting them, and start putting them in positions of management, putting them in visual positions that allow them to have a seat at the table, but not just a seat at the table, but to allow them to have an actual voice in the conversation. I think that's the biggest thing they can do. I remember, actually, if you see it now, I mean, for those of us, all we can do is stream most of the time right now. But if you look at, I think it's Netflix, Hulu, and I believe Prime, I've seen Apple TV have this. They've been doing it now, I think every month since the George Floyd murder. They have a section that talks about African American voices in movies. I think that's a big step for them. But I also believe, and I don't know about their structure in regards to management, but they made a good move there. Now do it in the boardroom, have more people of color at management in Netflix, in Hulu, in Prime, in Apple. And I'm not saying that they haven't, I'm just saying in general. So to answer the question, that's what these companies can do. Try to diversify their staff. Don't just say, well, I have 2 African Americans there, I'm good. No, start looking for African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos. Start diversifying your workforce, and you will have pretty much how America looks working for you.
Absolutely. So we're hitting 5 o'clock, but I just want to kind of wrap it up. What can folks do today to support Black-owned businesses, especially local businesses here in Charlotte?
Definitely. Well, there is a good segment, I think, on WSOC's website, the local news station here in Charlotte. They highlight a Black-owned business, I believe, every week. I would say go on there and look at Black-owned businesses that are in your area, here in Charlotte, and just go and support them. You'd be surprised. There are a lot of Black-owned businesses around. There are bakeries, there are bookstores. My wife and I always try to support as many as we can, and not just today, but do it do it throughout the year, because African Americans, despite everything we've been through, we have made a lot of progress. We have a long way to go, but we contribute a lot to society.
Thank you so much, Douglas. Really appreciate it. And thank you everyone who's joined us today. Douglas, if folks want to get in touch with you, they want to learn more about your work, how can they do so?
Sure. You can go to my company's website, which is alexanderwilsonconsulting.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Wilson Alexander. I'm on there, and on Instagram at DAWilson78.
Awesome. Yeah, I will add all that information when I post this on our YouTube channel, Advent Co-working Videos. So thank you again. And I hope everyone will join us next week. We have Bridget B. Sullivan. She's going to be talking about how you can make your virtual events accessible and inclusive to people with disabilities, and also language barriers. So another really important topic. So I hope to see y'all next week. Hope you all have a great evening.
All right, too. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.